What you are looking at is legendary director Andrei Tarkovsky's response to one of the worst things that can happen to a filmmaker. While filming the most expensive shot of his movie The Sacrifice, involving a man burning his house down in one long take, the camera jammed during the take and the house burned down, without being filmed.
Jammed.
They scraped together some money and rebuilt the house over 2 weeks to film it again, and this wonderful edit at the end is actually just the end of the take because they used up the entire reel on the one shot. Reportedly, the cinematographer had advised Tarkovsky to use more than one camera for the shot the first time around, but the director decided against it. I mean, at least he didn't choose to bring 0 cameras, although he might as well have. Now I bet you're thinking, that's some pretty bad luck right there. Well, that's nothing. 7 years before filming The Sacrifice, Tarkovsky sacrificed his sanity to make this movie, Stalker. Stalker had one of the most difficult productions in cinema history, and possibly even caused Tarkovsky's death. You don't have to have seen Stalker to watch this video, but it's possible that you already have. It's currently the #1 most streamed movie on the new Criterion Channel streaming service. So let's see why one crew member described the production of Stalker as a mirror of a hellish trip. This is Cinema Tyler Show. If you're unfamiliar with Andrei Tarkovsky, here is a mini bio. Andrei Tarkovsky was a Russian film director whose main work was between 1962 and 1986. His style was slow, methodical, and atmospheric, often involving really beautiful shots of nature. His father was a poet, and you could say that Andrei was a poetic filmmaker. He's most similar to directors like Ingmar Bergman or Robert Bresson, and you most likely have seen his influence even recently. Much like Christopher Nolan today, Tarkovsky's main interest in the art of filmmaking revolved around time. He thought of filmmaking as sculpting in time, and he is known for lingering on a shot for long periods for the purpose of, as Roger Ebert put it, absorbing you rather than entertaining you. My favorite movie of his is The Mirror, but I would start with Ivan's Childhood, about a child army scout during World War II, which is more traditional, or Solaris, about a space station orbiting a mysterious planet that creates perfect copies of people from your memory, which is his movie that seems to have caught on the most in the mainstream. And it's a direct answer to the cleanliness of Stanley Kubrick's Future in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Tarkovsky was quoted saying, "Let's make our space station look like a broken down bus." And he hated 2001: A Space Odyssey, by the way. And he hated it in a motivating way. It's very likely that we got Solaris because of 2001. And, it makes sense. Kubrick is one side of the brain and Tarkovsky is the other. And there's a fascinating video showing the similarity in style and imagery between the two directors, which I'll put a link to down in the description. Out of the 7 features Tarkovsky directed, only Solaris and Stalker were really science fiction movies. And it's really interesting to see Tarkovsky apply his craft to science fiction. Personally, I would love to have seen a Tarkovsky horror movie or even like a screwball comedy or something. Apparently, he didn't consider himself a sci-fi fan, calling the genre full of comic book elements and vulgar commercialism. So I guess he wouldn't like some of these sci-fi movies coming out now. But I'm sure there are many he would like, and many that were influenced by him. That said, shortly before his death, he saw James Cameron's The Terminator and said, "As a vision of the future and the relation between man and his destiny, the film is pushing the frontier of cinema as an art." Stalker takes place after a mysterious object from space crashes into a fictitious country. Troops were sent in, but never returned. The government put walls up around this zone to keep people away from its strange effect on reality. Imagine if you can, a forbidden zone of unimaginable mystery and one unauthorized guide to the zone known as a stalker, hired to sneak a writer and professor into the heart of the zone's magic, a room that grants the deepest desires of anyone who enters it. And it stars Natalie Portman. Just kidding. The film was based on a novella named Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers, and the film is extremely slow-moving, but that's the point. It envelops you. You feel like you're there instead of watching the story happen to other people. I almost feel like some of these really long takes allow your mind to wander as if you were the character. You're intrigued by the nature of the zone and what will happen next, but you're given space to contemplate the concept as the character would without being told what to think at any given moment. And the movie seamlessly transitions into these contemplative segments. Tarkovsky hired Georgi Rurberg as cinematographer. Rurberg had shot Tarkovsky's previous film, The Mirror, in 1975. They wanted to use the expressive texture of the abandoned power plants in Estonia and Tallinn, which, as strangely beautiful as it was, caused lots of logistical problems. The crew often had to work in some very uncomfortable situations for hours on end, but we'll get more into that later. One of the earlier issues involved Tarkovsky's wife Larissa, who demanded to play the role of the stalker's wife in the film. She was very difficult on the set, earning the nickname the Empress. Rorberg asked Tarkovsky if he wanted Larissa or the actual actress, which was apparently enough to get Tarkovsky to come to his senses and hire Alyssa. Larissa, his wife, was pissed, and she hated Rorberg. The real problems would begin once they got the footage back. The footage had been brought to a lab in Moscow to be developed, but when it was done, they noticed that the image looked dark and greenish. Now, I'm not sure why they were just starting to see the footage after several months of shooting, but nevertheless, the film was ruined. Months and months of extremely stressful, hectic work was destroyed. I mean, can you imagine looking back on all of the issues on the set and the problems, and realizing that you might as well have not have even had film in the camera at all? The problem was twofold: a mistake in the development along with a defective batch of film. Here are some stills from the ruined film so you can see what it looked like. They had been shooting on a film stock that was, at the time, experimental. Kodak 5247, actually one of the more famous film stocks. And the Soviet film labs were not yet experienced in how to develop it. Alien, The Shining, Star Wars, Blade Runner, and a ton of other classics were shot on that film stock. What happened next, as you can imagine, was a nightmare of determining who was to blame and the decision about whether or not to go on. They fired the second cameraman, who was apparently, quote, responsible for exposure, but it probably wasn't his fault. The next to go was the production designer, and so on down the line. Tarkovsky had already been having problems with the cinematographer, Rorberg, before the film stock was even ruined. Rorberg had said that he was trying to make his own film simultaneously. He even said that when he worked on The Mirror with Tarkovsky, which was Tarkovsky's autobiography, that, quote, Andre made a film about himself and I about myself. Luckily, it was the same film. That's kind of messed up, right? I mean, isn't that like hiring a stalker to take you into the zone, but instead he just takes you over to his house so he can show you his Blu-ray collection? And you're like, what's so magical about this place? And he's like, oh man, you just have to believe. You just have to believe, man. Rorberg was born into a highly intellectual family in 1937 during the height of Stalin's repression of poets and artists who were often arrested for their work. The thing you must realize is that Stalker is about an artist, a writer, who lives under a repressive government. Of course Rorberg is going to want to tell the story. His parents probably drilled into his mind the importance of authority in your artistic voice. So Tarkovsky and Rorberg would often butt heads on the set, and one time Tarkovsky asked Rorberg to do an effect that he saw in an Ingmar Bergman movie, and they even had a special studio made to get the effect, but Rorberg couldn't do it the way that Tarkovsky wanted, and Tarkovsky just flipped out on him. Man, I wish I knew what the effect was. If you have any idea, let me know in the comments. So when he found out that the film stock was ruined, Tarkovsky immediately fired Rorberg.
Hasta la vista, baby.
This was a whole thing, and there was even a documentary made in 2009 detailing Rorberg's side called Rorberg and Tarkovsky, the reverse side of Stalker. In 1993, Tarkovsky's diaries were published, and not only did he write that Rorberg was a terrible cinematographer, but that he sucked as a person too. But this disdain might not have been as intense as it seemed. Apparently, Tarkovsky would often dictate his diary for various people to write down, including his wife, who, you'll remember, hated Rorberg's guts. According to his diaries, the 70s were particularly tough for Tarkovsky. At one point, he considered quitting the cinema entirely and directing theater productions. I mean, there can't be a problem with the film if there's no camera, right? And Stalker was actually the climax of Tarkovsky's decade of anguish. His film Andrei Rublev from 1966 had been denied a domestic release, and the script he wanted to do for his next movie was denied because it was too personal. And this would later become The Mirror. The studio was ready to pull the plug on Stalker. They were losing money, but instead of scrapping the production entirely, they decided to let Tarkovsky try again. Tarkovsky had originally proposed a two-part film, and they used the leftover money to reshoot, but they only had enough money to shoot one of the two parts. With Rorberg gone, Tarkovsky had to find a new DP to shoot his film. He hired Leonid Kalashnikov, and the following autumn they reshot for months at an abandoned hydroelectric power station in Estonia, because the original location they wanted had an earthquake. Tarkovsky saw what he had shot, and it sucked. It had no magic. Tarkovsky was like, "This is bullshit, man. This isn't the way I wanted it. Damn it." So yeah, he fired Leonid. So Tarkovsky decided to shoot Stalker for a third time, and this time with a new cinematographer named Alexander. Tarkovsky changed the script around, and apparently the version that was shot by Alexander is very different from what they shot a year earlier. The version shot by Alexander is the one that we've seen. This final version of the film was shot using a KSN camera, which is the Soviet version of the Mitchell NC. Nearly every shot in the zone that isn't a close-up was shot using a Cook-Verotel 20 to 100mm T 3.1 zoom lens. This lens was, quote, as big as an artillery shell and cost the same as a passenger car. The first shot of the new production was the one where the handcar finally stops in the zone. The production designer Rashid Safulin said that the shots leading up to the men's entry into the zone required a large fence with barbed wire, but the production didn't give him any materials the second time around. Although, when they were ready to shoot, he saw that the fence had been set up. Could it be the zone? But really, he was implying that there was something going on in the background, whether that be stealing, finding, swapping, or, buying the materials somehow. Another shot affected by the diminished budget was the shot of the tanks lurking in the mist. In an interview, Safulin said, "The first year we had 7 or 8 tanks and 5 armored troop carriers. It was all brought from Moscow and placed around. The next year, there was no money. The limit was 3 tanks and 2 armored troop carriers. Alright, we took it." Andre said, "Can you draw a sketch of it?" "I worked for 2 or 3 days drawing the storyboard," because he needed a full-blooded picture, didn't he? With him, there had to be not a single unmotivated flower in the frame, let alone the tanks. We needed an illusion. A great number of tanks being there like something had happened to them. Like they had melted or gone to pieces, people in there disappearing somewhere. The whole scene had to breathe drama. He had 2, 3 scattered points in his mind. I knew the situation and I said, I'll do this. But they brought the tanks and gave us 1.5 hours instead of the 2 or 3 days that we really needed so they could be seen from several angles. And they had to be placed at the very entrance. But a tank passing the marshland destroys it for 5 to 10 years. And there had to be no trace that they had just been brought there. We needed an illusion they had been there for 20 years, overgrown with moss. So it was a predicament. That said, Safulin noted that as much as Stalker was altered over the course of its productions, not a single alteration was accidental. It was a result of complex creative work. Apparently, the alterations were so frequent that they were doing them even way back during the first version with Rurberg. They would change something in the script and end up having to reshoot the entire scene. Tarkovsky is so good at making the setting look stunning that you don't realize how miserable it was to actually be there. One scene had the crew standing for hours, quote, up to their knees in stinking puddles of oil while effluent discharge upriver from a paper processing plant enveloped the set in a fetid miasma. This went for months on end. In fact, one of the only 2 shots from the original version of the film that made it into the final cut involved a river covered in reddish foam. This was, quote, the waste of pulp and paper that was dumped into the river from an industrial complex. The other shot from the first version was the one where the camera floats over the mirror. The main part of the movie where the 3 men journey through the zone was shot at 2 hydropower plants on the Yagala River near Tallinn, Estonia, as well as in Mardu next to the Iro power plant. And some of the scenes before the scenes in the zone were shot at an old fluorochemical factory in the center of Tallinn next to the old Rotterdam salt storage and the electric plant. So you can probably tell where this is headed. Many of the crew members would later pass away from illnesses likely related to their time working near hazardous chemicals and radiation. 3 of these deaths would be Anatoly Solzhenitsyn, the fantastic actor who played the writer. Definitely make sure to check him out in Andrei Rublev and The Ascent. Tarkovsky's wife, and Tarkovsky himself. Tarkovsky was only 54 when he died. He could be alive right now. He'd be around 87 years old. Just think of all the masterpieces that we missed out on. The sound designer Vladimir Sharun is convinced that it was the chemicals that they were working around that killed them. He said that this shot here of what looks like snow falling in the summer and white foam floating down the river was in fact some horrible poison, and many of the female crew members got allergic reactions on their faces from it. This kind of makes the film feel similar to that picture of the core leaking out after the Chernobyl disaster. You shouldn't be able to see this and survive, and yet you're looking at it right now. And this picture was taken a decade after the disaster when the radiation had died down to 1/10 of what it had been. In fact, the Chernobyl disaster involving a catastrophic explosion at the power plant made the surrounding area uninhabitable, and the area was referred to as the zone of alienation. And some of the people who made trips into the zone to care for the Chernobyl power plant called themselves stalkers. So what happened to the first version of Stalker? I mean, it was a little greenish, right? We might actually be able to use color correction software to fix that. Well, sadly, the film was destroyed in a fire in 1988. And the people who had seen the first version said that even though it was damaged, it was still extraordinarily beautiful. Rohrberg may have also been one of the victims of Stalker's hazardous chemicals, having died at only 61 years old. Nearly all of the dreams Tarkovsky wrote in his diary between 1974 and 1977 involved being in prison, and one dream even had Tarkovsky escape from prison only to want to go back. Tarkovsky wrote, "At last, to my joy, I saw the entrance to the prison, which I recognized by the bas-relief emblem of the USSR. I was worried about how I was going to be received, but that was nothing compared to the horror of being out of prison." In an essay by Marc Le Fanu for Criterion, he argues that Stalker is a fantasy wish to leave Russia, but knowing that it would be either impossible or wrong to. In 1976, Tarkovsky had bought a new house about 200 miles southeast of Moscow, but in 1979, shortly after Stalker, Tarkovsky started traveling to Italy, ultimately deciding in 1982 never to return to Russia. Over the three versions of Stalker, 16,000 feet of film was shot, and yet some who have seen both the first version and the version we've seen claim that the two versions are almost identical. So who knows what's going on? I mean, they're identical, they're extremely different. I don't know, maybe the first one and the third one are similar and the second one was different. Who knows? But I'll leave you with a quote from an interview with Tarkovsky that I think really sums up this story. He said, "To make a film, you need money. To write a poem, all you need is pen and paper. This puts cinema at a disadvantage. But I think cinema is invincible, and I bow down to all the directors who try to realize their own films, despite everything." Thank you, Andre.